So in terms of the COVID relief package, it is um, smaller than I would have preferred. The House of Representatives passed on May 15th the $3.4 trillion HEROES Act. We then passed a second version after Mitch McConnell blocked the first one of 2.2 trillion. Again, Mitch McConnell, the White House blocked that. So we finally had to settle for this relief package of a little over 900 billion. So I think it's far too small. At the same time, it's better than nothing. And that's why I voted for it. It is, just as a factual matter, bigger than the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act under Obama, the stimulus package that was passed then. So it's not an insignificant bill. I just don't think it is big enough to address the scale of this pandemic. But there are some really good provisions in it. For example, there is $81.88 billion going to education, of which 54.3 billion will go to K through 12 education. That is 4 times more than the $13.5 billion in their CARES Act. This legislation also has $25 billion going to rental assistance and extends a moratorium on evictions for another month. It has $284 billion going to forgivable paycheck protection loans for small businesses. It's got $7 billion for broadband. It's got billions of dollars to ensure vaccine distribution and delivery. So there's a lot of very good provisions in this bill. I think the stimulus checks are far too small at only $600. At the same time, a family of 4 will get $2,400. So it's not insignificant. It's just not enough, in my opinion. And that's why I look forward to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris coming in on January 20th. And then we will try again with another round of stimulus next year. Mixed status families are included in this relief bill. In the first relief bill, if your spouse was undocumented, there'd be no relief. This one fixes that that sort of glaring bad provision. And so while we don't capture an entire family of undocumented, but if there's a mixed status family, we do capture that. If the Senate flips Democratic control, then I'm very confident there will be a third stimulus bill. If not, then I don't know. So we'll see what happens. There were a number of instances of businesses getting paycheck protection loans that should not have. At the same time, the overwhelming majority of small businesses got the loans, but there were absolute abuses. And that's why the House of Representatives set up an entire oversight committee to look at how their stimulus funding is being spent. That work will continue. And the Small Business Administration has repeatedly said they're trying to fix those issues. We also made sure that smaller banks, community development banks, and others, and minority institutions also were able to access this money to then give to the small businesses who are their customers. So it should be a better second version this time around, but we need to have continued congressional oversight because my view is you just can't trust the Trump administration. And that's just an ongoing problem.
So during the worst of the economic downward spiral, there was substantial relief for jobless workers that sustained them in the economy so that the recession was not even worse and the hardship was not even worse than it was. Bad as it was, it could have been worse. The cruel irony is that as the economy was starting to come out of the deep hole it was in, the $600 disappeared at the end of July. And there was no further stimulus to keep the recovery going, and the economy slowed. Unemployment remained high, the jobs hole remained huge, and UI benefits were pitifully small without that $600 for those who needed them most. So with almost 10 million fewer jobs than we had in February, and the pace of job creation slowing month after month, it was looking like we were making the same mistake that we made in the Great Recession. And we stopped providing stimulus and hardship relief prematurely. Furthermore, people of color were experiencing what they always experience over the business cycle, suffering disproportionate unemployment and underemployment in the recession, and seeing improvements much more slowly once the economy started to turn around. So at the beginning, all unemployment rates were at historic lows for whites, blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans. And then by April, white and black rates had jumped 11 points, the Latino rate had jumped 12 points, and the Asian American unemployment rate had jumped 14.5 points to 18.9%. In April, that was the group with the highest unemployment. In November, the jobs report I just reported on, the white rate was still almost 3 points higher than it was in February. But the Black and Latino and Asian rates were 4 to 4.5 points higher than in February. And those are recession levels. So I think one reason opponents of this round of stimulus that just got passed, one thing that they argued was, well, the economy is doing great. Why do we need additional stimulus? And the fact is that the economy was slowing down and we were only halfway back. Furthermore, the unemployment rate doesn't capture the full extent of unemployment and underemployment, because in a recession, people drop out of the labor force or can't get as many hours as they would like. The share of the population with a job, the so-called employment to population ratio, was lower for Black and Hispanic workers than for white workers at the start of the recession, and it's fallen more for them since. So beyond unemployment, people who've dropped out or not getting enough work, as much work as they want, is still way too high. So the latest legislation is a bit of a reprieve. The CARES Act I'm not sure what the name of the new legislation is, but it extended the additional weeks of unemployment insurance in the CARES Act. It added weeks. It expanded, extended the CARES Act's expanded eligibility criteria in the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, the PUA, and it reinstated a federal supplement. This time it was only $300, not $600. But these were only extended into March of next year. So I'll say that there are two things that are good about the reprieve. One is that, yes, in the CARES Act, it was cold turkey when the act was going to expire, so that no matter how many weeks of federal extended benefits you were receiving or PUA you were receiving, it just stopped. The new legislation has a phase out so that no one new can come into those programs after March 15th. March 14th, March 15th. But if you still have some weeks of federal benefits that you haven't yet used, you have until April 5th. So that's a smoother phase out. Nevertheless, we saw the good that the CARES Act measures did in providing stimulus to the economy and in relieving hardship. And in unemployment insurance, they were good. And it's good that they've been extended. But the economy is not going to be back anywhere near where it needs to be when we have to do it again. And we should be working from walking into office. The new Congress and President Biden and Vice President Harris should be working, among all the other things they're doing, to make sure that we have the stimulus that we need to relieve the hardship that's still out there and that will be needed to generate a robust, sustainable, and equitable recovery going forward. So the CARES Act looks a lot more like what permanent unemployment insurance should look like, with more weeks of coverage that ideally trigger on when the unemployment rate goes up automatically without Congress having to act, that recognizes modern life in which people may have to take off time from work to take care of a sick child, and that should be something that allows you to receive unemployment insurance, and it doesn't in many states. You still can't get unemployment insurance if you quit voluntarily, but that's the nature of unemployment insurance. So So the CARES Act was one of the unemployment insurance measures in the CARES Act were really quite strong, and it's too bad that that $600 lapsed just at the time when it could have really boosted the recovery even more. And I'm glad at least something is back.
Yes, we've seen 162,563 eviction filings since the start of the pandemic. Over 3,500 of those were filed just the week before last. There's been a steady increase in eviction filings over the course of the summer and into the fall. We're still well below normal eviction filing levels, however. Since the start of the pandemic, only about a third as many eviction cases have been filed as would be filed in a normal year. We've worked on some new analysis extrapolating across the country, and we're estimating that over 1.5 million eviction cases have been avoided this year. Of course, the kind of flip side interpretation there is that many of those eviction filings could get pushed into 2021. There's reason to be concerned about what happens when eviction moratoria start lifting. One of the reasons that we're pleased about the extension of the current eviction moratorium to the end of January is that we avoid a sort of 20-day gap between the end of this year and the start of the Biden-Harris administration. I think regardless, though, unless sufficient rental assistance programs are in place, we have every reason to expect that we'll be facing down a large number of eviction filings once the federal moratorium does lift. The scale of the problem also becomes clear when we look at the amounts that landlords are claiming in eviction cases. So prior to the pandemic, the typical renter who's facing eviction in Houston was being filed against for just over $1,000. It's about a month's rent in Harris County. That number is now at $2,000. So more cases are being filed, and more of them are for larger amounts of money. Whenever these moratoria lift, there are going to be a lot of renters out there who have a lot of unpaid rent, and we need that federal rental assistance program, at least the $25 billion that came out of this bill that was passed yesterday, to fend off just a huge number of evictions. I want to finish with one last point that I think is pretty critical in any reporting on or analysis of eviction. Black Americans bear the brunt of the eviction crisis. Across all eviction tracker system sites, they make out about 21% of all renters, yet they receive over 35% of all eviction filings. That was true prior to the pandemic, which is the bar in sort of teal here, and it's true today. It's what we're seeing since March 15th in the bar in dark blue. The history of housing in this country is a long story of dispossession and systematic racialized exclusion. We continue to see that playing out today in rental housing and the risk of displacement through eviction. I think it's critically important that we understand that there was an eviction crisis in this country well before the pandemic started. In a typical year, about 3.7 million eviction cases are filed across the US. So by context, at the worst of the Great Recession, when there was this foreclosure crisis, there were 2.8 million foreclosure starts. So the level of displacement that we see through eviction every year in a good year is much greater than the level of displacement that we were seeing during the Great Recession. It's just that it affects this population of renters who are generally the focus of much less policy intervention or concern. I think in terms of explaining the broad trends that lead us to this point, you look at wages being basically stagnant, especially for low-skilled workers over the last 20 years, while at the same time, rents have increased dramatically. So there are an ever larger share of renters who are burdened by housing costs and who really haven't seen any increase in their pay in decades. I think a lot will rest on what the Biden administration does probably on January 20th with the potential of extending the federal eviction moratorium. But the stimulus agreement that was settled, the $25 billion there is a significant down payment on rental debt. And there are some benefits in how that was structured. Representative Liu made mention of this, but the ability to pay renters directly is a very important step that will allow these programs to distribute funds more effectively and to potentially sidestep landlords who don't want to participate in these programs because they feel that it might limit their ability to evict tenants down the road. So, low range estimates of rental debt that have accrued during the pandemic suggest that, like, at a minimum, $30 billion is probably necessary. $25 billion takes us a good way there, but it's almost certainly not enough. And there are problems in distributing those funds. Over the course of the last 8 months, a lot of states and counties have figured out how to distribute that money more effectively by using CARES Act funds. And we're going to see this current batch of money is going to be distributed through the same channels. So some of the kinks in these programs have been worked out, but there are absolutely still problems in actually getting this money out and making rent paid.